Somewhere in the Western Pacific, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer holds its position. 96 MiG-41 vertical launch cells sit loaded in its forward and aft decks, 96 slots that represent the full striking and defensive reach of one of the most capable surface combatants ever built. 96. Not 97. Not 120. Exactly 96. For decades, that number was the ceiling, the wall, the hard limit. When those cells were empty, the ship was done. It turned around and steamed thousands of miles back to port to reload, because reloading at sea, in the open ocean, with live missiles the size of telephone poles, was considered essentially impossible under operational conditions. The Navy lived with that constraint for 30 years. So here is the question that should be nagging at you right now. If 96 cells have always been the hard limit, if reloading at sea was always off the table, why is the United States Navy now spending billions of dollars to do exactly that? What changed? What does that tell us about the Pacific, about the math of modern naval combat, and about what it actually costs to hold a line 10,000 kilometers from home? The answer is not what most people assume. And by the end of this, you will understand why the real constraint was never the number of cells at all. It was always something else entirely. To understand why 96 cells became a crisis rather than a specification, you need to understand what the MiG-41 vertical launch system actually is and what it was designed to do. The MiG-41 VLS entered service with the US Navy in 1986, first installed aboard the cruiser USS Bunker Hill. The concept was clean. Replace the old above-deck missile launchers. Rotating, exposed, mechanically complex. With a modular grid of sealed tubes sunk into the hull itself. Each cell could hold a single large missile or up to 4 smaller ones in a quad-pack canister. The system could fire in any direction. It required no traversing, no loading crew on deck. The magazine was buried deep in the ship where incoming fire was least likely to reach it. When the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the DDG 5-1 class, began entering service in 1991, they carried 96 of these cells. 61 cells forward, 35 aft. The Ticonderoga-class cruisers, which the Burkes were designed to operate alongside, carried even more. 122 cells across 2 launcher groups. That pairing was intentional. The cruiser brought deep magazine depth and battle management. The destroyer brought speed and presence. But here is the first thing that matters. The Ticonderoga cruisers are being retired. The last of them is scheduled to leave service within the next few years, which means the Arleigh Burke becomes not the complement to the magazine-heavy cruiser. It becomes the primary surface combatant. 96 cells is no longer the secondary number. It becomes the only number. And 96 cells, it turns out, is not very many cells at all. Not in the scenario that Pacific Fleet planners now spend the most time thinking about. Here is what those 96 cells actually carry in a typical deployment mix. Some slots hold SM-6 interceptors for air and missile defense. Some hold SM-2S for layered air defense at shorter range. Some hold Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. Some hold ASROC anti-submarine rockets. The exact mix is classified, but the rough proportions are no secret. A Burke on patrol typically devotes the majority of its cells to air and missile defense, because that is the threat environment of the Western Pacific. The attack and anti-submarine mission loads fill what remains. The problem is asymmetry. An SM-6 interceptor costs somewhere in the range of $4 to $5 million per round. It is a sophisticated weapon. Active radar seeker, high maneuverability, dual-mode capability for both air defense and anti-surface strikes. It is, by almost any measure, the right tool for the threats it is designed to counter. But the threats it is designed to counter are cheap. A commercial drone modified for attack can be built for tens of thousands of dollars. An anti-ship cruise missile from a mass production line can be built for a few $100,000. And when a peer competitor operates not tens, but hundreds of these weapons simultaneously, in a coordinated saturation attack designed to overwhelm a ship's defenses, the arithmetic runs in exactly the wrong direction for the defender. What's most surprising about this problem isn't the cost gap alone, it's the geometry. A Burke defending itself in a saturation scenario does not spend 1 SM-6 per incoming threat. In a dense, multi-axis attack, it may spend 2 or 3 interceptors per target to achieve reliable kill probability. Now run that math against a coordinated strike of 40 or 60 incoming weapons. You can burn through a substantial fraction of the ship's entire magazine in a single engagement sequence. After that, the ship is not just less capable. It may be effectively disarmed for air defense. And that is a condition its adversaries are actively trying to create. This is the scenario that drove the Navy's thinking. Not a single isolated engagement, but a sustained campaign in the Western Pacific, where a Burke-class destroyer might face multiple saturation events in the space of days or even hours. In that environment, the distance to the nearest reload point is not an administrative inconvenience. It is a tactical vulnerability. Ility of the first order. Let us put some numbers to that distance, because this is where the problem becomes visceral. The Western Pacific is enormous. The distance from the Luzon Strait, the northern gateway to the South China Sea, to Guam is roughly 1,500 nautical miles. At a Burke sustained cruising speed, that is roughly 5 to 6 days of transit each way. Add the reload operation itself. Days at the pier with qualified ordnance handling crews, cranes, certified facilities. And you are looking at 2 weeks or more of a ship being completely absent from the operational area. 2 weeks. In a high-intensity campaign where the operational picture changes by the hour, pulling a destroyer off the line for 2 weeks to reload is not just expensive, it can be a decisive event. It removes that ship's radar, its interceptors, its tomahawks, its sensor integration from the tactical picture at the moment when all of those things may be most needed. Now multiply that by the size of the surface force. The Pacific Fleet cannot keep every Burke on station simultaneously. Ships rotate through maintenance cycles, crew rest requirements, logistics, windows. In a real sustained campaign, the number of fully loaded Burkes actually on the line at any given moment is a fraction of the total force, and the adversary knows that. Campaign planning in Beijing has certainly wargamed the mathematics of magazine depletion against available reload capacity. Here is where the comparison with the regional competitor matters, not to score points, but to understand the pressure. Chinese naval planners at PLA Navy shipyards have been building the Type 055 large destroyer at a pace the US has watched closely. Each Type 055 is assessed in open-source analysis to carry roughly 112 vertical launch cells, organized in a modular arrangement. More importantly, China has been building Type 055S and their smaller Type 052D cousins at a rate that, in recent years, has exceeded the rate at which the US is commissioning new surface combatants. Magazine depth across the entire fleet is not just a per-ship problem, it is a fleet-wide arithmetic problem. The US advantage in the Pacific has always been qualitative. Better sensors, better combat management systems, better trained crews, more integrated joint operations. That advantage is real and substantial. But qualitative advantages are purchased with money and time, and they can be saturated with volume. If an adversary builds enough cells to put enough missiles in the air simultaneously, the per-shot quality of the defender's interceptors matters less than how many interceptors the defender has left. That is the logic that sent Navy planners back to a problem they had considered, and shelved, decades earlier. What would it actually take to reload MiG-41 cells at sea? The technical problem is genuinely hard. An SM-6 in its canister weighs more than 1.5 tons. Moving it from a supply ship to a destroyer's VLS cell requires a crane, a specialized rigging fixture, a precise vertical alignment above the cell, and then a controlled lowering into the launch tube. The cell itself is not a simple open-topped cylinder. It has a blast deflector system, an umbilical connection, a retention latch. The reload process requires qualified explosive ordnance personnel, specific safety clearances around the area, and coordination between 2 ships moving in proximity to each other. All of that is manageable in port. None of it is simple at sea, particularly in the sea states that characterize the Western Pacific, where swells of 3 to 5 meters are routine, and where the relative motion between 2 ships conducting a replenishment evolution can turn a precision crane operation into an extremely dangerous exercise. The Navy ran initial at-sea vertical launch reload experiments in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They demonstrated the concept was possible, but concluded that the operational risk, the equipment investment required, and the weather windows needed made it impractical for routine deployment. The program was set aside. What brought it back was not a new technology. It was a new threat calculus. In the 2010s, as PLA Navy modernization accelerated and as the DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles extended the threat range across the Western Pacific, US Pacific Fleet wargames increasingly produced outcomes where magazine depletion was a decisive factor, not a footnote. The distance to Guam or Japan was not just a logistical number. In the wargame models, it was the variable that determined whether a surface force could sustain a campaign or whether it would exhaust itself and be forced to withdraw regardless of its kinetic performance. The physics of the Pacific was doing to the US surface force what no adversary had managed to do. Put yourself in the position of a Pacific Fleet surface warfare planner in 2018 or 2019. Your Burkes are capable, well-maintained, and crewed by professionals. But the wargame results keep telling you the same thing. Your ships are winning individual engagements and losing campaigns, because every time they empty their magazines, which happens faster than anyone likes. The reload timeline pulls them off the line for weeks. The adversary does not have to destroy your ships to deny your presence. It just has to keep your missiles fired and your reload facilities far away. The solution, to the extent there is one, had to be at-sea reload. Not convenient, not easy, but necessary. The cost of making it possible is substantial. the Navy's current program to develop and field an at-sea vertical launch system reload capability, sometimes referred to under the broader at-sea reload program, involves investments across multiple lines. Specialized crane and rigging systems designed to manage the relative motion between ships. Modified handling equipment aboard both the destroyer and the ammunition ship acting as the supply vessel. Modified VLS cells or cell covers to facilitate the reload interface under operational conditions. Training pipelines for the ordnance crews who will conduct the operations. None of this is cheap, and the unit economics matter. The system does not just have to be technically possible, it has to be operationally practical. A reload evolution that takes 3 days per destroyer under ideal weather conditions, with a dedicated ammunition ship in attendance, is not the same as the weeks-long port cycle it replaces, but it is also not a rapid turnaround. The logistics chain has to be pre-positioned. The ammunition ships have to be forward deployed. The weather has to be assessed, and the evolution called off if sea state is too high. And those ammunition ships, the vessels that would carry the reload missiles and serve as the mobile magazine for a forward-deployed surface force, are not stealthy, not particularly fast, and not meaningfully armed. They are, by the nature of what they carry, high-value targets. A single hit on an ammunition ship loaded with SM-6 canisters is a catastrophic loss, not just of the ship and its crew, but of the entire magazine reserve that the surface force was counting on for sustained operations. That trade-off defines the strategic shape of the whole program. The Navy is not eliminating the constraint of 96 cells. It is moving the constraint from the ship to the logistics chain. The ship can stay on the line. But now the logistics ship has to stay on the line with it, within range, and that logistics ship becomes the most important and most vulnerable node in the entire force package. This is the paradox the program creates. Solving the magazine depletion problem requires an asset that creates a new, arguably more fragile single point of failure. Here is where the realities of Pacific geography compound the problem in ways that are not immediately obvious. The Western Pacific does not offer many sheltered positions for a logistics node. The areas where the ammunition ship would need to operate to support a forward berk, inside the first island chain, within range of the South China Sea approaches, are precisely the areas most covered by PLA air and missile systems. The DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile has an assessed range of roughly 1,500 kilometers. The DF-26, sometimes called the Guam killer in the press, extends that reach to 4,000 kilometers or more. An ammunition ship holding position within replenishment range of a forward, berk sits well inside the coverage arc of both systems. The Navy's response to that problem is, again, not simple. The ammunition ship would need its own escort, additional surface or subsurface assets to provide screening. It would need to be positioned, moved, and concealed using the same operational security tradecraft applied to a carrier strike group. It would need to be able to receive resupply from rear area ships, which means the logistics chain extends even further, back to Guam, to Japan, to the continental United States. Each link in that chain is a node that can be targeted, delayed, or interdicted. What's most surprising about this is not the vulnerability itself. It's how the structure of the problem mirrors the exact asymmetry the adversary has been trying to create. The PLA strategy for the Western Pacific, as assessed in open-source DoD analysis and academic strategic literature, is not to outfight the US Navy ship for ship in a high seas battle. It is to impose costs, extend timelines, complicate logistics, and force a situation where the US surface force cannot sustain presence within the threat range of the Chinese mainland. That is A2/AD, anti-access/area denial. In its operational form, not sinking ships, but making the math of operating in the region work against the defender. The at-sea reload program is an attempt to beat that math by decoupling the ship's operational presence from the distance to its reload point. It is the right instinct. But the ammunition ship that makes it possible is, itself, exactly the kind of high-value, hard-to-defend logistics node that A2/AD strategies are designed to threaten. Here's the take that will probably get pushback. The at-sea reload program does not solve the magazine depth problem. It relocates it. The 96-cell ceiling has not been raised. It has been made temporarily resettable at the cost of an entirely new category of operational vulnerability. That may still be the right trade, but calling it a solution understates how much of the underlying problem remains. The economics of the exchange rate between interceptors and attackers run through every calculation in this space, and they deserve a direct look. An SM-6 in the mid-2020s carries a unit cost in the range of $4 to $5 million per round. The US currently has procurement programs to expand SM-6 production, but missile industrial base capacity is a constraint that has shown up repeatedly in Pentagon assessments. The factories that build these interceptors cannot simply be scaled up overnight. When the Navy spends $1 billion on SM-6 interceptors, it is buying roughly 200 rounds. That sounds like a large number. Spread across the Pacific Fleet surface force, the Burkes, the remaining Ticonderogas before they retire, the future DDG-X program that is still years from fleet entry. 200 rounds begins to look like a modest addition to magazine depth. Against the threat side of the ledger, the comparison is uncomfortable. A Chinese PL-15 air-to-air missile costs a fraction of an SM-6. A YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile, the primary anti-surface weapon of the Type 055 and Type 052D, has an assessed unit cost in open-source estimates of roughly $2 to $3 million. Still expensive, but less than the Interceptor trying to stop it. And in the drone category, the economics are not even close. Commercial derivative drones modified for attack missions can be produced for tens of thousands of dollars. Saturation attacks using waves of these weapons force a defender to spend high-cost interceptors or accept hits, and there is no clean way out of that math. One detail that sticks with me from the public record of this debate. In a 2023 Surface Navy Association symposium, senior surface warfare officers noted that in certain high-density attack scenarios, defending a single ship to magazine exhaustion could consume assets worth more than the ship itself. That is not a winning exchange rate in a long campaign. The at-sea reload program helps by keeping the ship in the fight longer. It does not change the fundamental economics of the exchange. The Interceptor still costs more than the threat. The logistics tail to sustain the Interceptor inventory is still enormous. Will this program work well enough to change the operational math in the Pacific? Comment why yes or no. We genuinely want to know where you stand. So what has the Navy actually demonstrated, and where does the program stand now? The key operational demonstration came in 2024, when the Navy conducted what it described as the first successful at-sea reload of a MiG-41 VLS cell under near-operational conditions, using a modified crane system and a supply ship positioned alongside a Burke-class destroyer in the Pacific. The demonstration validated the basic mechanical concept. The crane system could manage the weight and dimensions of the canister, the ship-to-ship movement could be compensated for within an acceptable margin, and the cell could receive a loaded canister and be confirmed ready to fire. That is a genuine achievement. The engineering challenge of controlling a 1.5-ton explosive canister suspended from a crane on a rolling ship, with another rolling ship alongside, while coordinating 2 crew teams and maintaining safety clearances around a live weapon. All of that is legitimately difficult, and the Navy's demonstration showed it was feasible. What the demonstration did not show was routine operational execution under contested conditions. The 2024 test was conducted in controlled conditions, with pre-planned coordination in acceptable sea state, with full communications between both ships, and with no one trying to sink either vessel at the time. The step from a successful proof-of-concept demonstration to a weapon system that a fleet can depend on during a sustained campaign is substantial. Equipment needs to be ruggedized for combat damage tolerance. Procedures need to be trained to the point where a crew can execute in degraded conditions with reduced manning and communication constraints. The ammunition ship needs to be capable of being defended or concealed. None of those problems are insurmountable. All of them take time and money that are already in competition with other urgent priorities. The DDG-X program, the next-generation destroyer designed to eventually succeed the Burke-class, carries a stated goal of significantly expanded magazine depth, possibly in the range of 300 or more cells depending on the final design. If DDG-X delivers on that promise, the at-sea reload problem becomes less acute for the next-generation force. But DDG-X is not currently planned to begin commissioning until the mid-2030s at the earliest, and program slippage is a historical pattern, not an anomaly. Until then, the fleet that holds the Western Pacific line is the fleet that exists. Arleigh Burke destroyers, 96 cells, and an at-sea reload capability that is real but not yet mature. The most important thing about this whole program may not be the crane system. It may be what it signals about the Navy's willingness to re-examine assumptions it held for decades. The assumption that sea-based vertical launch reload was impractical held for 30 years, and it was reasonable when it was made. The threat environment did not require challenging it. The Pacific of the 1990s was not the Pacific of the 2020s. What strikes me about this moment is that the Navy's decision to invest in at-sea reload is as much a strategic signal as it is a technical program. It says explicitly that sustained presence in the Western Pacific matters enough to pay the logistics cost and accept the new vulnerabilities that come with it. That strategic signal comes with a human cost that rarely appears in the technical analysis, but which shapes the operational reality in ways that eventually affect everything else. An Arleigh Burke destroyer is crewed by roughly 300 personnel. A deployment to the Western Pacific typically runs 6 to 9 months. The operational tempo for Pacific Fleet surface forces has increased substantially over the past decade, driven by growing demand signals. More exercises, more freedom of navigation operations, more presence requirements, and a force size that has not grown proportionally. The result is a service population that cycles through deployments at a pace that creates persistent pressure on retention, on family stability, and on the depth of experience at every level of the crew. Adding at-sea reload operations to the deployment profile is not simply a logistics addition. It is an additional complex, high-risk, labor-intensive evolution that the crew must plan, train for, and execute on top of everything else. The ordnance handling crew for a reload evolution is small, but the planning and safety overhead involves large portions of the ship's leadership. Conducting a reload while simultaneously maintaining defensive watch, managing the ammunition ship's coordination, and keeping situational awareness in a contested environment is a genuine crew workload challenge. The adversary's calculation about long-term sustainability includes this dimension as well. Retention in the US surface warfare community has been a persistent challenge. Experienced personnel, mid-grade petty officers and junior officers who carry the institutional knowledge of how to operate complex systems, leave at rates that routinely concern force managers. Every additional requirement piled onto the operational tempo is another factor in the retention equation. Here is the obligation the program creates. If at-sea reload is to be genuinely operational rather than a demonstration capability, the training pipeline, the crew qualification process, the equipment maintenance cycle, and the personnel assignment system all have to be resourced to support it. That is not a given. The US military's history with capability programs that were technically validated but logistically underfunded is long and instructive. We cut a detailed look at the Navy's ammunition ship acquisition program from this piece for length. Comment RELAD if you want a dedicated breakdown of that specific logistics challenge. The broader question of what this means for deterrence in the Pacific turns on a single underlying dynamic, and it is worth stating plainly. Deterrence in the Western Pacific does not operate the way it did in the cold Atlantic, where the US-Soviet confrontation was structured around well-defined lines, established escalation protocols, and a relatively stable geographic balance. The Pacific presents a different geometry. Enormous distances, multiple overlapping subregions with different political dynamics, an adversary whose maritime power is concentrated close to its home territory, and whose logistics requirements are therefore fundamentally shorter than those of the force trying to project power from 10,000 kilometers away. The tyranny of distance is not equally shared. The at-sea reload program is one piece of an effort to reduce the distance penalty for US forces, to allow a surface force to sustain presence in the theatre without the constant withdrawal reload return cycle that has characterized the structural constraint of the MiG-41 VLS for 3 decades. In that sense, it is strategically sound. A destroyer that can be reloaded in the theatre without withdrawing to Guam or Japan extends US presence in a way that the adversary has to account for. But presence requires more than full missile cells. It requires fuel. And the US surface force depends on underway replenishment ships for fuel at sea, creating another logistics node that can be targeted or interdicted. It requires maintenance. And complex combat systems require periodic access to facilities that the forward theatre does not fully provide. It requires threat intelligence, and the distributed sensor networks that feed Burke's Aegis combat management system are themselves part of a contested information environment in which the adversary has made substantial investments in electronic warfare and cyber. The full picture of what it takes to hold the Western Pacific Line is a logistics organism of extraordinary complexity. Ships, supply vessels, tankers, intelligence assets, space-based systems, submarine communications, infrastructure, shore facilities from Japan to Guam to Hawaii. And every node in that organism is either a constraint or a vulnerability or both. The at-sea reload program addresses one constraint. It does not simplify the organism. On paper, reloading MiG-41 cells in the open Pacific looked like a logistics impossibility. In practice, it turned out to be a hard engineering problem with a tractable solution. What it has not changed is the fundamental arithmetic of great power naval competition in the world's largest ocean. Here is where the original paradox resolves, and where it doesn't. The Arleigh Burke destroyer's 96 cells were never the limit the Navy thought they were. They were always a proxy for a deeper constraint, the ratio between the time a ship can fight and the time it must spend restoring its capacity to fight. Reloading at sea does not increase the number of cells. What it does is change the denominator. It reduces the time the ship is off the line, which has the same effect on sustained presence as adding cell, would at a fraction of the structural cost. That is a genuine strategic gain. A Burke that can be reloaded in 3 days at sea, rather than 2 weeks at port, is not the same ship operationally. Its presence on the line is not interrupted by the same long absence. The adversary's campaign planning cannot as easily factor in a guaranteed reload window during which the ship is absent. But the gain comes paired with a new vulnerability that is arguably harder to manage than the original constraint. A pier at Guam or Yokosuka is fixed, hardened to some degree, and has air and missile defense. An ammunition ship holding position in the Western Pacific Theater, close enough to a forward berth to conduct a reload, does not have those properties. It is large, slow, valuable, and difficult to defend without diverting significant assets from the ships it is supposed to be supporting. The ceiling of 96 cells has not been raised. It has been made temporarily resettable at the operational cost of tethering the destroyer to its most vulnerable support vessel. The constraint did not disappear. It moved. What is the more reliable line-holding strategy in the Western Pacific? A ship with a larger magazine that withdraws to a safe reload facility, or a smaller magazine that can be reset forward, at the cost of a vulnerable logistics node in contested space? Both approaches have a price. Both have a failure mode. The Navy has chosen to pursue the forward reload capability, and it has reasons that are strategically coherent. Whether those reasons hold up when the logistics node is targeted in a real campaign is a question that no exercise has yet fully answered. The 96-cell Burke will remain the backbone of the US surface fleet through the 2030s. The at-sea reload capability, as it matures, will give those ships a longer operational reach than they have had in any prior decade. The ammunition ships that make it possible will be among the most important and most watched vessels in the theater. And the adversary's planners are working through exactly the same arithmetic we just walked through, looking for the logistics node that is hardest to defend. That is the real competition in the Western Pacific. Not ship-to-ship combat in the traditional sense, but a contest of logistics, depth, presence, mathematics, and the ability to sustain a force at distance under threat. The side that solves that problem more completely, that finds a way to hold the line without exposing an irreplaceable node to unacceptable risk, will have found something more durable than a weapon system. It will have found a strategy. So here is the question we are leaving with you, which is the more stable foundation for deterrence in the Western Pacific. A ship with a deep magazine that must periodically withdraw to safety, or a ship with a resettable magazine that pulls an ammunition ship into harm's way? Neither is without cost. Neither is without vulnerability. Tell us your version in the comments. We read every one. And in the next piece, we'll break down exactly where the DDGX program stands today, and whether its promised 300 cells are a realistic answer or a distant aspiration.